Hey YouTube, it's Dimitri, and today we're going to do an introduction to risk management. This is a very high-level, holistic view. Again, sponsored by my company here, Quant LLC, which does consulting in the risk management space, as well as quantitative finance, academic consulting, and career consulting. But let's dive on in here. What is risk? Now, I've been asked this on multiple occasions from executives, from teams, employees, across the board. Risk is more or less the potential for an outcome that negatively impacts a person or an organization. So this is a very, very broad definition of what risk is, but this is truly what risk is, and this is the purpose of risk management. Now, getting to this from a practical perspective, one of the pushbacks I see from firms that don't want to do risk management or they don't want to expand their risk management practice here is they're going to say, like, we can't manage every risk under the sun. So based on this definition here, we could easily say, you know, me getting in my car today to drive to work, I could get in a car accident. That's a risk. You know, I could choke on a ham sandwich at lunch. There's all these ridiculous things. We don't need to track all this. This is a huge waste of our time. We just don't need to do this. We're not going to do risk management. That's where more or less this presentation comes in, which is how do you assess risk management, look at it from a holistic view, but also how do you weigh it and how do you structure it such that it's beneficial to you, right? Maybe you do something crazy dangerous, like maybe, I don't know, you race motocross for a living. The chance of you dying is quite high. So you might want to manage those sorts of risks. Where getting in a car accident, right? You put your seatbelt on, you've managed it, and you move on with your day. You don't worry about it. So really, when we look at this, really we have action and we have inaction here. And on one hand, there's going to be cost and paranoia, right? If we take too many actions, it's going to get too expensive to manage, maintain. It's going to be burdensome. There's going to be red tape. We don't want to have so much action and so much risk management going on that it impedes the business from actually doing anything of value here. And cost is going to be, you know, counter to profit here. So we need to keep that into consideration. We also have inaction. So inaction is going to be damage, loss, and failures that occur from just not doing anything. So putting our head in the sand and pretending risk doesn't exist is an inaction. You're just refusing to acknowledge it. You will see here too, there are also cases where you just don't go looking for risk. And so you just pretend like it's not there. And it's like, well, I didn't even know that was a risk. But again, risk management is going to be the discovery process, the governance behind this. How do we record this? How do we monitor these sorts of things as well? So we're really doing this balancing act here within the risk management framework. And again, firm size is going to be absolutely critical to this. If you're a large institution, you might have regulations that require it, but I would argue you should be doing much more risk management just from the fact that it's beneficial to the business and it will help the bottom line. But also if you're a smaller firm, you might need to take little, you know, summarized versions of these to make it worthwhile to manage your risks across the entire spectrum here, but perhaps not getting so in depth and so in the weeds that it becomes prohibitive to kind of actually make a profit and run a business here. One of the core foundational principles is going to be the 3 lines of defense. I do not think you can get away from this. Firms I've seen try to operate in risk without 3 lines of defense end up failing because the 3 lines of defense more or less put some sort of challenge in that process here. So the first line of defense is going to be the business, right? Everything your business does regularly, the operations teams, the credit teams, the manufacturing teams, if you're a manufacturing business, engineering, like all of these things are going to be the business that we typically do here. They are part of the risk management process because they're going to be responsible for reporting and identifying risks. They are responsible for making decisions in their daily business regarding risk, right? It is not the responsibility of your risk management teams to make decisions for the business. They are not the business. The business itself owns the risk, manages the risk, and takes responsibility for what they are doing in their actions here. Now, model development teams that build models for the business are still included in first line of defense in most firms. Operations teams, credit, commercial, like anything in the process of your daily business is going to be the first line of defense here. Now, the second line of defense is going to be effective challenge. You need somebody who's going to come in from an oversight perspective and challenge how things are done. This could be something as simple as like a credit committee, right? You have a division that makes decisions, that wants to book loans, that does sales in the event of a business that makes loans here, like a bank. There's going to be someone that comes in one of these committees that sits back in compliance or validation or ERM, which is enterprise risk management, and challenges the decisions that are being made. Like perhaps we should not allow this deal to go through that breaks our rules. We shouldn't be stretching it. because the amount of risk that's associated with that, and some analysis is done and a dollar value comes out of that. So risk management, which is the second line of defense, is called model risk management. For validation teams that work on the modeling side, there's compliance, and there's also ERM, which is enterprise risk management, which is more or less the actual risk team across the board that does a lot of things that are more policy, procedures, governance driven. But it's the most critical part of actually managing risk is going to be ERM as a big framework here. And then finally, you have the third line of defense. So third line of defense is going to be typically internal audit. Now, thinking about this from a quantitative finance perspective, because that's tend to what my channel covers here, validation teams are the second line of defense to model development teams. So model development builds some sort of model statistically. Validation comes through, challenges that model development process, does some sort of analysis and review here. The same thing happens on the non-quant side, right? You might have a credit policy that's driven by data and data decisionings. A policy is put into place. Again, ERM compliance, someone's going to challenge that and say, do we really want to set these thresholds? Have we looked at something else, right? It's an effective challenge that's going on. They are not making the decision, but they are there to challenge them. That's the main line of second line. And why I mention that is third line, at very, very large institutions will have both quantitative and qualitative people across the board. As firms become much smaller, it doesn't really make sense to have quantitative people on your internal audit teams at smaller firms. It's just not smart cost-wise here. It's gonna be a lot of extra money insight going to this, but you should have your standard internal audit that looks at accounting, financial reporting, oversight, again, on your validation, compliance, and ERM, and also oversight over the business and the effective challenge process that's going into this entire framework here. Now, can you get away with less lines of defense? You can try it. I've never seen it actually work. You will notice the business is there to make money. They will stretch and bend the rules when necessary, trying to make an extra buck. Risk management is all about looking at things from a large, disconnected perspective here. Oftentimes, you'll have a chief risk officer at a firm. They do not report into the CEO. They actually will report to the board of directors. Again, trying to have some sort of separation and effective challenge. Now, there's often a dotted line on daily responsibilities, annual reviews, and everything into your CEO, because that's really who you work for. But having some sort of way to kind of report issues or misdeeds in that first line of defense, which could include your CEO, is a critical step to actually separating and having an effective challenge process here. Now, risk alignment here. Risk is a firm-wide exercise. Everybody is responsible for risk management here, but this needs to be included into the entire process of how you plan, organize, and drive your firm. This is especially clear in financial firms because you have risk and reward. You're not going to make a profit and have a reward if you don't take some sort of risk. The same goes through in every other business as well. But I tend to look at this from starting from the risk appetite, right? How do you do your 1 year goal for the company? How do you do your 5-year goal, your 10-year goal, your 20-year goal, whatever your goals are you set up for the firm? And then how do you set some sort of statement on what is the risk appetite? The reason this is critical as well, and you can do this, again, setting firm-wide risk appetite, and then everybody aligns their goals, structures, and processes to kind of play into that firm-wide risk appetite. But it is much easier to have a rule of a risk appetite of what you're setting, whether that's numerical thresholds of, credit losses, market loss, so all sorts of issues, and how you classify in KRIs, which I'm not going to go through in this slide. It's looking at this from the perspective of how do you align the business to risk now, so that later down the road, when it's very tempting to kind of stretch and bend the rules to make a little bit more profit, we don't do that. Or we take a complete effective challenge process on reviewing the rules and seeing if we need to make an exception or if we need to change the thresholds or the limits here from a very high level strategical position. We have seen financial firms fail time and time and time again, especially in the trading spaces, where we see somebody who says, well, I had this sort of threshold or limit. If I can just go a little bit further, I'll make a little bit more money back. Or now I have losses. I need to cover those losses. Let me take a little bit extra risk here to make a little bit more profit to cover the original losses. Again, having a solid structural risk appetite in place is very, very important to even get this entire risk exercise started. So I would start there if you're building this out from scratch. Next is going to be coming the risk topology here, which we're going to cover in the next few slides as well. How do you assign and categorize risk, right? We're talking risk as this big hand wavy thing. It could be anything in the world. Every firm's going to categorize them differently. So I've looked at risk topologies from a variety of different firms, consulting firms, banks, even, for example, like hedge funds, talking to them how they structure and categorize risk. So risk topology, how do you set these things up? How do you categorize them? Once you categorize them, you know what you're looking at. Then you can start to measure them, analyze them, and keep an eye out for risks that are going to be coming up on the horizon. And then finally, risk inventory. So now we have this appetite. We know what our risk boundaries are, our goals are. We have a risk topology, which helps inform us of the different types of risks that we see and how we categorize them and who is responsible and owns these sorts of risks. And then finally, we have risk inventory, which is where we track, monitor, and manage all of our risks in some sort of massive inventory. Now, I say massive inventory, but it could be a smaller inventory depending on how you set up your risk framework here and the needs of the firm itself. So let's talk about the action that we can actually do here. You need to set up your framework, you need to have your definitions, you need to set your process, and you need your tracking. So answering these common questions here on the right of what is a meaningful risk? Again, you might set a dollar value, like if risk is more than X or potential risk is more than X, we need to record, manage, and maintain it. If it is something frivolous and small, we don't need to waste time with that. What value or cost is going to be there? I have seen risks which big firms have identified. There's been a quick analysis and they've realized to set up and really do something about it is going to be extraordinarily tedious and expensive. And it's going to cost a lot more than even if we took that risk on and that event occurred here. So trying to understand what is the meaningful threshold on a risk that we would and would not classify. How do we define, add, and remove risks? Again, from our inventory here. And I'll go through that process in a few slides later on how we do this. But more or less, you're going to want to inventory things, track them. And then sometimes risks just don't solidify, right? It happens. It looks like it's coming on the horizon. Maybe it's a political event or something. And then it just goes away. So you just say, okay, that was monitored, added to the inventory. It's gone away with, no action needed. Also, as risks come up, what are the decision-making processes? What are the analysis? Where are they at in that process here? At firms, these can get lost in the flux. Even small firms can have a bunch of different risks identified, which I've seen happen. And then we get busy, we forget, and then all of a sudden something occurs and everyone's like, why didn't we do something about that? Well, it's coming back to how do you identify, manage, and maintain those risks, which is going to be in that risk inventory section. And then the last bullet point here is going to be the absolute hardest to do, especially if you don't have a risk structure, is how do you get full company involvement? Yes, I think you should have a risk management department who maintains and builds these systems and gets the conversations going and does inventory management and puts this whole thing together we're talking about today. But everybody in the firm is a part of the risk solution, right? That first line of defense needs to identify risks in their business, their decision-making, their processes. Even executives and senior management looking at the long-term trajectory and environment that a company is operating in needs to look at, manage, and maintain risk on that stance here. One of the ways that a lot of firms do this is they do annual trainings. And I know everyone's cringing right now because I hate doing these trainings. But it's a good way to kind of remind everybody that you are responsible for the risks that you take. You are also responsible for identifying risks that you might not even be involved in, but you see coming. So getting everyone involved is a big challenge. Showing the value add often takes a few years because as you set all this up and you get a bunch of financing from the company to build the risk out and the risk team and manage and maintain it and the systems and the people, it takes time to see it really take root and take hold as a culture. Once you really start to get the ball rolling though, typically about 2 to 3 years in, you start to see good payback from this. Everyone starts to understand it. Everyone's happy. We've avoided some risks now, some losses, and now we're like, all right, it's starting to pay back on itself here. So getting that involvement is a critical part here of the risk management process and structure and design. So here are some examples of risk topology. So you're going to have to develop this out yourself. Every firm is different. The way you view things, categorize things might be unique to you. You might even have a section that just doesn't really exist in your business here. Like maybe you do, I don't know, commercial lending, but you don't do retail. Maybe you're a trading firm, you don't do derivatives, you only do equity. There might be things that you look at that are impacted on how you categorize your risk here. Now, these are just some of the common ones. There is a longer list of this if you want to go online and just look up and start searching risk topology, risk categories. You'll find entire presentations from other people on this. But banks and financial institutions typically have credit risk, market risk, operational, strategic, compliance, reputational, ESG, liquidity, technology, talent, and HR here. A few that I'd like to point out, right? Obviously, the market and credit and operational are all standard. Things that are a little bit fuzzier, that are a little bit harder to find, like strategic risk, reputational risk, even like HR and talent management. Again, imagine you go through some sort of negative publicity event, something occurs. How do you manage that, right? Was there something you could have done, a policy you could have put in place to help prevent it? Again, managing talent in HR is a competitor taking all of your top talent. Maybe that is a risk, right? You're losing top talent. It's going to tank the business. It's going to lose money. How do we go about strategically getting ahead of that? Are you monitoring, for example, metrics around like retention rates? Right, these sorts of things are simple. They seem kind of stupid and not risk management related, but they impact the business in critical ways here. Reputational damage is something that a lot of big institutions spend a lot of time thinking about. They will even have policies in place to help prevent employees from sharing things or misrepresenting a firm. Maybe an employee has a tweet, social media post, and they don't intend it to be bad or negative, but it gets, gets on fire on the social media and it really takes off and it becomes this big reel or this big video or post or something. And you can have significant reputational damage from these sorts of things here. So looking at these, creating classifications, this is just a good starting point to get you going, to think about the process, what risks you really face as a firm and how you're going to manage these. And then finally, most topologies get put into this little pretty diagram here that looks like, these old ancient Greek buildings. Typically you have board of directors on the top, meaning they are the, oversight of the entire risk management process. Again, your CRO should be reporting risk and risk issues up through the board. So the board is aware of any sort of issues that may be arising or coming, or lack of support even from the business here. Looking at this from a board of directors perspective is going to be top down here. And then you have all of your divisions and operation teams in the middle. These are the categories we talked about earlier, right? Even some of these might fall into one person's responsibility. Again, maybe talent and HR fall into one, maybe compliance and reputational go together. Maybe they're separate. Again, there are different ways to categorize these based on your title and structure of your firm itself and the executives or teams that you end up having here. This is a simplified example just showing credit, market, operational, compliance, and technology. Of course, you're going to have heads of these departments. Some are going to be executives. Some aren't going to be executives, depending on your firm's line and structure. And again, your risk management department is kind of the foundation here, right? We set up the framework. We set up the monitoring, the inventory. We're helping getting all this put together, assigning responsibilities and ownership. And then it's really up to these pillars of each division to own their responsibilities, their decision-making, and their risk management. And then again, you have the board on the top that is really the oversight of what is going on underneath. It needs to be made aware in case you have some sort of significant issue on how the firm is being ran here. So there are many ways to do this. Do not take this as the best way or the only way. I've seen many different ways of doing this, but more or less your risk inventory has kind of these 4 steps here. You have the identification of a risk, right? Something comes up, this could potentially be a risk. And we'll go through an example here in a second. And then you assess and measure this, right? Because I can say this is a potential risk, but I don't know. It's going to take time and effort and money to kind of evaluate this. So somebody might come through the identification process and make a quick judgment call on yes or no, we don't need to chase this further. Then you might get into the process of assessing and measuring this to really see, do we have data to measure this and analyze this? Could this be a key impact? How is this going to be assessed and reviewed? And then finally, we need to get down to the decision part. There are really 3 decisions you can make if you identify something as a risk. You can just accept the risk and just continue on with your day and not do anything, but just know it is there, and you might even monitor it, but you accept that it is there. You can manage the risk, which again is going to be the process of, we're going to take some sort of action here to mitigate that. So if you're driving a car, right, when I put my seatbelt on, that is an action I am taking to help mitigate that risk here. And then finally, you can avoid the risk. Some risks are like, hey, do we want to get into the cryptocurrency space? And you might say, no. It's just too much of a reputational risk. There might be a lot of financial risk with that. Maybe we have talent issues as well. We're just going to avoid it altogether, and we're just not going to get into that business. We're not going to do anything in that realm of that risk. That's an example of the avoidance here. Now, again, when you manage and accept it here, the acceptance is you still need to monitor and maintain what is going on with that. Even with the avoidance part, there needs to be some monitoring often that goes on to this space to assess, is it a strategic risk? Are there other sorts of things that could come down the pipeline that could inadvertently affect you guys? There needs to be at least in the risk inventory that it was identified, and then some review of whether it needs to be monitored or not, given the resources that you have or the resource constraints that you might run into here. When you go to manage the risk, though, you can do a variety of things. You could build some sort of math or statistical model, right? It's predicting something, you're tracking it, you're looking at it, you're modeling, you're forecasting out into the future. Could be a tool. So a tool could be a forecast that's just not really based on a lot of data. And also it could be a business strategy or decision or rule there, right? You might say like, I don't know, let's say we're going to do lending of loans for, I don't know, personal loans, for example. They're not asset backed here. You might have a rule and say, this is a risk that we're going to have too high of defaults in here. We're going to put a credit policy in place that we do not make personal loans more than $10,000 or more than 2% of their income, right? Their annual income here. You might have some sort of rule in place. Again, that is a management strategy. You're putting a rule there. You're putting a boundary, a guidance in place. And then, of course, the last step of the decision process is after you make the decision, after you do a tool or a decision or policy or whatever you have, you still need to monitor this process here. And you'll see I have the acceptance and the management portion of monitoring. Avoidance is a lot rarer to monitor, but there are cases where you'd want to do that. And then you need to go through the monitoring process of we have everything set up, we're operating as usual, let's monitor that, right? Nothing is worse than saying this is a risk, we made a decision, and then we forget about it because things change, things move. A policy you might have put in place, for example, of personal loans, maybe that $10,000 is killing the business. We're not getting enough volume. We need to move that up to $20,000. Or maybe you're running in subprime and the risk is extraordinarily high. $10,000 is much too high, and you scale that down to maybe a maximum of $5,000. Again, you need to monitor these things so that you can adjust your risk policies and how you kind of behave and act and manage so you can come back and cycle through that risk to make sure you're truly managing that. You're not just pretending it's there and just making an inventory for the sake of having an inventory. So let's do an example here. A little while back here, right, Trump announced some tariffs. Let's say we announce a tariff on China here. We've identified it, right? There is a risk coming up. This Trump tariff on China could be a big impact on whatever firm we're at. Next, we'll go through the assessment and measurement process here. What exposure does the company have? Again, this will depend on your line of business. If you're in manufacturing, this might have huge implications for you. If you're in another area, it might not. But again, you want to look at like your corporate clients, your deposits, your home construction, your auto loans, consumer debt. Like, what are the products and pieces of your business, even your vendors, your corporate clients, like looking at the inflows and outflows of your business, where are you going to get impacted on this tariff here, right? This is where you would want to look at. It might not impact our employees internally, but it will impact things above and below us, depending on kind of looking at your stream and your business and your process here. Things to consider. Even when you think about something like an auto loan, it might impact the valuation of a vehicle. It might impact the ability for that consumer to pay here because now prices perhaps are going to be going up because of the additional tariffs. Who knows? But trying to look at the exposure and kind of looking at the measurements and the data that we do have, that's gonna be something you're going to need to kind of run through and make some estimates on and try to get some, good quality quantitative methods when possible. If not, lean on expertise in qualitative methods to get to some sort of assessment of the situation itself. In this example here with the tariffs, we want to look at, for example, like what is the probability the tariffs will even occur? That's a possibility. We want to look at what are the potential values of those tariffs. Is it 1%, 10%, 100%? Like, what are these things? And how do we measure that process and exposure here? You might create a few different scenarios even. You might have 3 scenarios, which we think are very likely, and you can create these sort of scenarios and then do some assessment off of that. Once you have all of your data and your analysis, everything put together here, you're going to want to make some sort of decision. Now, you might just accept it, right? We might say there's nothing I can do. I'm not in politics. I'm just going to accept the fact that this risk is going to occur. We'll put a monitoring plan in place with thresholds and future decision points. So you might accept the risk today, monitor it, and in the future decide we need to take some sort of action. So maybe the tariffs haven't been put in place. We don't know the results, but this is the action plan we have currently. As soon as those tariffs do officially go in place, these are the 3 options we have. If one of these events occurs, this is what we'll do, or we'll reassess this. Again, you can also consider exiting a specific line of business. Like maybe your business is predominantly in the US, but you have a division that's predominantly impacted by China. You might say, we're going to exit that. Like maybe it's, international growth in the Chinese markets. This might impact this and hurt you negatively. You might decide we're just going to close out, not originate new business in that process there. You could also go through this process of not accepting it, but actually managing it. So if you're getting your imports, if you have imports from China, whether it's, sorts of metals or whatnot, you could go through this process of looking at derivative products to kind of hedge that risk, because you know there's going to be some big increases in prices coming, and you can take some sort of action on that. Again, you need to look at that in the form of timelines, right? Are we only able to hedge 6 months out, 12 months out? What are we going to do in the long term? Going through that full process and having internal discussions. And then finally, risk inventory, right? We need to make sure that we inventory this in this entire process. So as we identified that we had this coming, we first put that into the inventory, okay? Potential risk. Then it might get moved in this example to an economic risk. We've now classified it into one of our risk pillars here in the topology. And then we're going to say we are going to set metrics up for monitoring that. So again, I have a little kind of action chart here. If you have identification, yes or no, not a real issue, not a risk, do nothing. If it's identified, put in the inventory like this one has been put in, we assign some sort of risk type to it. So we assigned economic risk. And then we went through the analysis part and we need to decide whether to accept, manage, or avoid. In this case here, we decided just to accept it. There wasn't a lot we could do, but we are aware of it. We're going to have to adjust our business strategy and our positions to account for perhaps increased costs here. And then we go through that process and you manage that. Now the risk inventory isn't a live thing. As you know, these risks go through it, they will be retired and closed. And you can see here in this slide, just giving you an example. This is very, very simple. But you might have an ID so you can quickly track and identify them, because you might have multiples that are similar. Like maybe you have a tariff on China for 2 different goods. Maybe you're just tracking those. How is that going to get impacted? And so you'd have IDs for that. You have a name for it. You have some sort of risk category based on your topology. And then you have whether it has been classified as a risk or not. If it's really not a risk, maybe it doesn't have financial impacts, maybe it's not big enough to be classified as a risk in the firm, then you would just more or less close out and say, yes, this was reviewed. We want records of this. We understand this, but it was not deemed a risk. And then you have status as well. So is this an active risk that we're managing, monitoring, maintaining? Has this risk been closed? Is it retired? Again, looking at the different statuses that you can come up with here. Again, you might have an identification process. The risk is there. It's been identified, but nothing's been done. All right, you need to know where it's at in this process. And then it might be active. You're actively managing it or taking some sort of action or accepting it. And then eventually, if you have something that's been, retired might mean that you did something, you managed, you monitored it, it closed, things have passed on, it's been retired. Other things, for example, like maybe if it's not a risk, then the status is just closed. So it was never actually activated. It just went to closed status. And again, you might have some metrics in here as well, like probabilities, exposure to the firm itself, which are hard to assess. You might have qualitative approaches for trying to estimate these things and getting them to a number, and then doing the impact of what we think the final impact is. So in this example, all I'm doing is probability times exposure to get impact. And then finally, you might end up having risk tiers. So risk tiers are ways to look at it as well. You might have dollar values to set the tiering, and then you might have also different rules around monitoring, management, and a bunch of involvement of how many resources you want to dedicate to an issue or potential risk, given the risk tier rating. If it is something like a tier 3, it's low risk, not a big issue. You might have a small team look at it. Maybe a little rule goes into place and you monitor it and you move on. Maybe if it is something like the tariffs and it has a huge impact on your business, it's tier 1, you can allocate a full risk team, getting the business involved, doing a full-blown plan, and really dedicating a lot more time to this because it's going to have big impacts on the business. And then finally, I want to talk about risk governance because I feel like this is the unsung hero of the risk space here. I'm just going to call it governance as a whole here. More or less like enterprise risk management covers kind of like the governance and the qualitative sides, as well as the quantitative modeling, validation, and a bunch of other sides of this as well. But risk governance is really what keeps the wheels moving on the risk framework here. They're typically part of your enterprise risk management. They might have other titles, responsibilities, and whatnot, but they're the ones that set up this risk framework. They manage the inventory. They also do project management, and they manage the progress and the deadlines. When we went back through here and you have like a risk inventory, you can imagine as this grows, it gets a little like hard to handle and maintain and manage. You need somebody that makes sure that the departments are putting the risks in, that we're adapting risk management practices. You need someone that's going to follow up with people and say, hey, that deadline for that risk assessment was due on, October 15th. We've passed the deadline. And then you need to have clear escalation processes as well, because I've seen firms that have failed with this where it's like, yeah, my deadline's the 15th, so what? Like, we're 6 months past, so what? This is when risk management needs to get escalated up through your executive team. And if that doesn't fix it, it really should go to the board, and the board should come down with a heavy hand on, we've agreed to do risk management for a reason. It protects the business, shareholder value, also makes all of our jobs a little more stable, makes the firm more profitable. And then those things need to happen and occur here. But they manage all this progress, the management, the processes here. Again, they challenge the first line in many different ways as well here. So don't view risk management as just modeling and math. I know this is what my channel focuses on heavily, but I've spent a lot of time on the non-modeling side as well, and looking at risk management from a different perspective here. You've got probably those employees that have been in the industry 20, 30 years. They are excellent for challenge and, challenging that first line of defense as a risk management second line here. They can come in and look at this and say, like, I know the economy's hot. I know this looks like a great opportunity, but we need to put these sorts of rules and thresholds in place to manage that risk, because I have seen these things go south in the past. So they are there to challenge as well on both a business insight perspective, qualitative and quantitative, pulling in data and making that challenge happen. Again, reporting and monitoring as well. Again, we do all these reports. You might have policies and procedures around risk, and each division has different policies and procedures they need to follow. Often when you get large, they have to go through committees and compliance. You notice I didn't mention a lot about committees here, because small firms probably aren't going to have a lot of committees at all, whereas large firms are going to have a lot more committees and oversight and involvement. Again, you need to right size your risk. What is the right size for your team and your company, and what resources do you want to invest in that? That's up for you to deciding to figure out. And then again, risk and controls assessments here. So again, someone even needs to come back and challenge what was put in place on these thresholds, right? A business is going to be a whole lot more willing to, stretch the risk framework or the risk KRIs, key risk indicators, or KPIs, the key performance indicators, trying to make sure they hit their goal and they look great for the year. But again, enterprise risk management and your governance teams as well need to come back and assess those and make sure those are being followed. So you might even have a policy in place. No one's following it. It's there, but it's not being followed. So again, that's where these other sides of risk management, the enterprise risk management, come into this as well. And then even meeting notes and action items on this. I've seen this happen a lot. You'll go to an executive team. We talk about risk. Risk management's the most hated team there, and they bring up, we have this issue and no one's addressed it, and it's been sitting and it's behind schedule, and we're going to make some sort of action on this, and this team said they were going to do this. Again, following up on those action items of, are we doing that and what actually happened, right? It's not always the fun job doing risk management, but you kind of got to hold people's feet to the fire sometimes. So there is a full-blown ERM, which is more what this is, but also risk governance in this process of all the tracking, controls, monitoring, reporting, management. There's a lot to risk management here, and making sure that we're tracking and monitoring all this, because, as I mentioned, you might have a great inventory and all this, and you might have great teams that are adapting the risk, but if no one's monitoring it and following up on the action plans and what's happening, right? It's like we're all just dumping a bunch of stuff in a system and no actions are coming out of that. So it needs to be this full kind of feedback loop. And often your enterprise risk management and governance teams are there to help facilitate and to keep people reminded that, yes, this is not your day job per se, but this is actually part of your day job, and we need to make sure that we're on top of our risk management here. So anyways, that is my quick introduction overview of risk management here. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, put them in the comments below here, or reach out to me on LinkedIn, or you can go to my website, which I'll put in the description as well, and you can do a contact us from that page as well. So anyways, thanks for listening, thanks for watching, and as always, until next time.